April 15, 1986, the United States Navy conducted a bombing raid on Libya, which resulted in the deaths of 2 American pilots, 45 Libyan soldiers and officials, and between 15 and 30 Libyan civilians. The most infamous casualty was a baby girl recently adopted by Libya's dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. The popular narrative recounts the story as an unchecked cowboy president disproportionately responding to a minor terrorist attack outside American borders. But this popular narrative has some glaring omissions that paint the story in a radically different light. Some of these omissions are based in ignorance, but others are politically motivated and deliberate. Let me tell you the story of the cowboy and the madman, Ronald Reagan versus Muammar Gaddafi. On September 1st, 1969, the Libyan monarchy was overthrown in a military coup led by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who quickly went on to reshape the country into his personal fiefdom. He nationalized foreign banks and oil companies and canceled numerous other contracts with foreign entities. He shut down foreign military bases on Libyan soil and began receiving arms from the Soviets, and it didn't take long for his regime to generate exiles fleeing his oppression and tyranny. Gaddafi would go as far as hiring assassins and hit squads to kill Libyan dissidents protesting his regime overseas. One of these attempted assassinations happened after a dissident living in the US exposed the financial ties between Billy Carter and the Libyan regime. Another Libyan-backed murder was uncovered in Chicago in May 1981, which gave the newly inaugurated president, Ronald Reagan, the excuse to expel Libya's diplomats and shut down their embassy in Washington, D.C. Since the withdrawal from Vietnam, U.S. foreign policy had been in a malaise, and policymakers had grown fearful of utilizing American military power for fear of being drawn into another prolonged war of occupation. Ronald Reagan was one of the new figures on the right, referred to by their opponents as neoconservatives, who believed that the United States could and should use its military power to better the world, and Gaddafi was in his sights. Gaddafi was a madman who was becoming an increasing concern not only to Western democracies, but also to moderate Arab regimes and the civilized world. Through terrorism, he was trying to unify the world of Islam into a single nation of fundamentalists under rigid religious control, an ecclesiastical form of justice that, in its most radical forms, was regarded by many in the West as barbarous. He was seeking to accomplish this goal using Libya's oil wealth, Russian weapons, and terrorism. As early as January 21, 1981, the Reagan administration was discussing what to do about Gaddafi. Secretary of State Alexander Haig would meet with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, complaining about Gaddafi's support for terrorism and his destabilization of Africa, in particular his intervention into a civil war in neighboring Chad. Despite Libya having received a steady stream of material and financial aid from the Soviets since 1970, did Britain act like Gaddafi was solely an American problem? The Reagan administration was also concerned about Gaddafi because he was using Fidel Castro in Cuba to funnel weapons and money to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, as well as other leftist militant groups throughout Latin America. Additionally, he was destabilizing the Middle East by sponsoring various Palestinian terrorist groups such as the PLO, PFLP, Black September, Abu Nidal, and others, including attempted assassinations against Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, a valuable American ally. Along with international terrorism, Gaddafi violated international law by claiming the entirety of the Gulf of Sidra as its territorial waters, when the limit was 12 nautical miles. He made this claim in 1973 and threatened military retaliation to any nation that crossed its proclaimed maritime border, which he dubbed the Line of Death.
Gaddafi had long maintained claims, insupportable under international law, that he controlled the entire Gulf of Sidra. He also claimed that Libyan territorial jurisdiction extended northward an indefinite number of miles beyond what even Libya defined as the Gulf of Sidra.
To counter these claims, the U.S. would periodically perform naval exercises in the eastern Mediterranean, intentionally crossing the line of death in order to probe his defenses and test Gaddafi's resolve. This led to a brief confrontation in 1973, which resulted in successive presidents to be less provocative towards Gaddafi's claims. These freedom of navigation operations were halted by President Carter during the Iranian hostage crisis, but the new Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, insisted that they be resumed, which President Reagan authorized.
Gaddafi now had to decide whether to take active measures to try to deny us our right to exercise and move freely in international maritime areas he claimed as his own, or be recognized internationally for what he actually was, an empty braggart easily able to make threats, but able to do little more than indulge in an overflow of rhetoric or use his oil revenues to employ terrorists to try to carry out his threats.
Weinberger ordered that flights over the Gulf of Sidra become a regular part of patrols in the eastern Mediterranean, and that nothing Gaddafi does should discourage these activities. And President Reagan authorized the US Navy to shoot down any Libyan aircraft so long as they fired first. And nothing hackers do should prevent you from protecting yourself online, which is why I am happy to work with this video's sponsor, Aura. Are you tired of all the spam calls and emails you get on a regular basis? I know I am. And ever since getting that silver play button there, it's become far more frequent. And not being careful about that stuff is how my channel got hacked earlier this year. Well, Aura is a comprehensive service that helps protect your digital life. Data brokers make a fortune selling your information to robocallers and spammers. Aura can identify the seemingly countless data brokers and fill out their opt-out request for you, which is extremely handy because the brokers make it difficult. But Aura is really easy to set up, giving you parental controls, antivirus protection, a password manager, and a VPN all in one app. You can either let people continue to exploit your personal information for profit, or you can protect yourself with Aura by going to aura.com/casualhistorian to start your 2-week free trial. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video, but for now, back to the history. The night of August 19, 1981, a freedom of navigation operation was led by the USS Forrestal and USS Nimitz, with F-14 Tomcats patrolling the skies, penetrating Gaddafi's line of death. Libya responded by deploying MiG-23s to intercept them. Commander Thompson S. Sanders was sent off in a S-3A Viking to circumnavigate the Gulf of Sidra within Gaddafi's claimed territorial waters, but outside the internationally recognized 12 nautical miles. The Libyans deployed a pair of Su-22s from an air base near Sirte to intercept Commander Sanders, but the F-14s patrolling this mission would counter them. The Libyan fighters fired missiles at the Tomcats, who were then given permission to return fire, shooting down both Su-22s. The president was asleep and in California at the time. Weinberger and Ed Meese, the president's counselor, debated if they should wake him, despite having already received authorization to return fire if fired upon first. Some in the Navy advocated for withdrawing north of the line of death in order to avoid escalation, but Weinberger refused. After the initial melee, there was no further fighting between the Libyans and Americans, and the carrier group continued to send reconnaissance flights throughout the night. At a press conference the next day, Weinberger was asked if the mission was intended to provoke Gaddafi, and whether he was happy that the incident had happened, to which he responded,
"I don't think it's necessary to do any amateur psychoanalysis at this time. The mission of the planes was to fly patrol, and if attacked, if fired upon, to respond. That's exactly what they did, and I would say again, without leaving myself open to any other interpretations, that I think they carried out their mission well."
The government of Margaret Thatcher also expressed support for U.S. actions against Libya, and President Reagan praised Weinberger's handling of the situation.
The president strongly approved what had been done and felt that our action that night was a turning point. That now both our friends and enemies realized that they had a very much different America to deal with. An America that was stronger, better, and a more reliable ally. And a country that would not be intimidated or diverted by threats from people like Gaddafi.
Gaddafi allegedly ordered an assassination on President Reagan after the incident, along with Vice President Bush and Secretaries Haig and Weinberger. The president had wished he could do more, but feared what Gaddafi might do. With hundreds of Americans living in Libya, there were limitations on what we could do in response to this evil man. Through diplomatic back channels, we sent word to Gaddafi that any acts of terrorism directed against any Americans would be considered acts of war, and we would respond accordingly. After the dogfight over the Gulf of Sidra, I hoped he realized I meant what I said. It would be 5 more years before they would clash again in the Gulf of Sidra. But in those intervening years, Gaddafi was far from silent. If you want to learn more about that, go ahead and watch this previous video. In December of 1985, the Palestinian terrorist group, Abu Nidal, conducted simultaneous attacks against a pair of airports in Rome and Vienna, which killed American citizens. The passports found on the culprits had been confiscated from Tunisian citizens working in Libya and then given to the terrorists in order to cover their tracks. Abu Nidal was one of many terrorist groups that had received training in Libya. On top of this, Gaddafi publicly referred to the attacks as heroic. Reagan would say, By providing material support to terrorist groups which attack U.S. citizens, Libya has engaged in armed aggression against the United States under established principles of international law, just as if he had used its own armed forces. The Defense Department and Pentagon had been wargaming out numerous potential retaliations against the Gaddafi regime in the event of provocation. These plans were referred to as Operation Ghost Rider. Back in October, a military exercise consisted of a prolonged flight out of the RAF Upper Hayford base against a target in Newfoundland, rehearsing the refueling measures they would need to take. It was intended to simulate the distance between the United Kingdom and Libya. But the administration wasn't ready to commit to such an attack just yet, and instead the president signed an executive order cutting off all economic ties with Libya, and bringing all American citizens and businesses out of Libya so they couldn't be used as hostages in the event that retaliatory strikes were necessary. If Mr. Gaddafi decides not to push another terrorist attack, okay, we've been successful with our implied threat. If, on the other hand, he takes this for weakness and does loose another one, we will have targets in mind and instantly respond with a hell of a punch. Although the president was turning up the heat in terms of rhetoric, behind the scenes he actually seemed to be trying to de-escalate tensions. Unbeknownst to Secretary of State George Shultz, Bill Clark, Reagan's former national security advisor, had been using the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, William Wilson, as a back channel to communicate with Gaddafi. In January of 1986, Wilson met with Gaddafi in Tripoli and told him not to take the president's pronouncements against him and Libya too seriously. Shultz was angered by this break in the chain of command. This back channel was being operated without his knowledge or that of the U.S. ambassador in Rome, Max Raab. Initially, he thought this was being done against the will of the president, but he soon discovered that Reagan had requested Clark and Wilson do this himself.
Wilson was pulling strings inside the White House, but whose strings, I did not know. Was it even possible, I wondered, that Wilson had misled the president into asking the Italians to set up a meeting for him in Tripoli? I was certain that Ronald Reagan was not going soft on terrorism or on Colonel Gaddafi.
Fearing that Wilson may have misled the president on the nature of his messages to Gaddafi, Shultz met with Wilson in February and told him that the back-channel talks were over, and President Reagan didn't override the decision. Several more freedom of navigation operations were held in early January and February of 1986, and another was scheduled for March. The Defense Department and National Security Council had just revised the rules of engagement for the U.S. military. Before, if a fleet was confronted by a group of hostile aircraft, but only one of those hostiles fired on the patrol, you could only shoot down that one aircraft. Under the new rules, if the patrol is fired upon by any number of hostile ships or aircrafts, they have the right to return fire upon all of the hostile crafts, not just the one that fired first. Some in the Reagan administration thought these new rules were still too restrictive. Secretary of State George Shultz argued that they should be allowed not just to return fire on the hostiles, but also go further onto land and attack military installations.
An important principle was at stake. We had to make clear that Libya could not avoid responsibility for attacking American civilians and others by using Palestinian terrorists to do the job. International lawyers would argue these murders were not, quote, attacks on the territory of the United States.
By 1986, there was little debate in the NSC on whether the U.S. should continue its freedom of navigation operations in the Gulf of Sidra. The March 1986 naval exercises would be the 19th one conducted since 1981. Prior to the March exercises, Caspar Weinberger met with Admiral Frank B. Kelso II, the commander of the 6th Fleet. The Defense Secretary wanted to clarify his interpretation of the new rules of engagement and assure him that no matter what decision he made, the Secretary would back him up. This was especially important this time around because Libya had bulked up its arsenal with new weaponry and surface-to-air missiles from the Soviets. The mission consisted of 3 aircraft carriers, the USS America, the USS Coral Sea, and USS Saratoga, joined by 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 6 frigates, and 250 aircraft. On March 24th at 6 a.m., a cruiser moved south of the line of death with air cover provided by F-14 Tomcats. Libyan missiles stationed near Sirte fired at them around 7:52, missing the targets. 2 more missiles would be fired around 1:52 p.m. The Libyans claimed that they had hit the Tomcats, while the Americans claimed to have jammed the missiles, causing them to miss their targets. Around 4 p.m., 2 MiG-25 Foxbats took off from Benina Air Base with orders to shoot down some of the U.S. fighters, but the U.S. Navy detected them before they could reach the F-14s. The Libyans began aggressive maneuvering against the U.S. aircraft. The commander of the USS Saratoga gave permission to the F-14s to open fire if necessary. Throughout the evening, the Libyans would periodically send additional missiles and send out more fighters to confront the Americans, resulting in at least 35 Libyan casualties, but no American casualties. Angered by this embarrassing loss, Gaddafi brought in the Italian ambassador and told him that they would be targeting U.S. bases on Italian soil if tensions escalated. That same day, Gaddafi sent a message to its European embassies, ordering them to begin orchestrating terrorist attacks against American citizens, regardless if they were military or civilian. On March 27th, he gathered all the foreign ambassadors in Tripoli and declared that a state of war now existed between the U.S. and Libya, and that all American military installations within NATO countries were targets for Libyan attacks. King Fahd of Saudi Arabia urged Gaddafi to refrain from further military actions, but the Mad Dog of Libya was out for blood. On a broadcast on Libyan state TV on March 28th, Gaddafi called on Arabs around the world to attack anything and everything American, and announced that Libya was training suicide bombers to attack American and European targets. In a public rally in Tripoli on March 30th, Gaddafi gave a fiery speech, which culminated in an ox with an effigy of Ronald Reagan painted on the side being slaughtered in public for all to see. On April 5th, a nightclub in West Berlin, La Belle, known to be popular with U.S. servicemen stationed in Germany, was targeted. A bomb was placed under a table near the disc jockey booth and exploded at 1:45 a.m. The explosion killed a Turkish woman, Nermin Haney, and a U.S. Army Sergeant, Kenneth T. Ford, and a second sergeant, James E. Goines, would die from his injuries 2 months later. In addition to the deaths, 229 others were injured, 79 of whom were American. The CIA obtained communications between Tripoli and their embassy in East Germany, ordering the attacks. The Reagan administration blamed the Libyan government for the attacks, but German law enforcement didn't have access to the communications the U.S. had, and therefore doubted the accusation. Some in the administration wanted to reveal them, but this risked exposing their source, which would make further intelligence efforts more difficult. Members of the State Department advocated swift retaliation, calling for a bombing raid on a city in whatever country was behind the attack. But this was opposed by both Secretary Weinberg and President Reagan.
He very much opposed anything that could hurt or kill innocent people, so we had agreed that we would make a focused response whenever we identified and located a terrorist. A response that had at its aim the discouragement of any country or any person using terrorism from ever doing that again.
The Defense Department dusted off their plans built around Operation Ghost Rider the year prior and began looking over specific targets in Libya.
The purpose of our plan was to teach Gaddafi and others the lesson that the practice of terrorism would not be free of cost to themselves, that indeed they would pay a terrible price for practicing it.
On April 7th, a meeting was held between Schultz, Reagan, Bill Casey, Poindexter, Will Taft, and General John Wickman, where they discussed potential targets. Schultz was against targeting Gaddafi's personal residence, fearing that they would miss him, making the mission look like a failed assassination attempt. Gaddafi was known to sleep in a different location every night, usually making the decision last minute so nobody in his regime could betray him. On the night of April 7th, Reagan wrote this in his diary: "I'm holding out for military targets to avoid civilian casualties because we believe a large part of Libya would like to get rid of the colonel." A Foreign Affairs article later that year expressed the same sentiments.
Meanwhile, the majority of Libyan people, overlooked and unconsulted, hardly seem to share in Gaddafi's international designs. Few Libyans seem to believe in terrorism, still refuse to believe their government has been involved in it.
On April 9th, they finalized the targets. Some considered attacking Libya's oil installations, but that was rejected. Bob McFarlane, the National Security Advisor, had encouraged the idea of getting Egypt to launch a simultaneous land invasion, but Hosni Mubarak declined the invitation. Reagan got permission from Margaret Thatcher to use RAF bases for the raid, but couldn't get permission from the French, Spanish, or Italians to fly over their airspace for it. In particular, France refused to allow the US to use their airspace because the US only wanted a limited strike, whereas France was advocating a much bigger operation that would remove Gaddafi from power. They were also holding a grudge after the US withdrew from a joint airstrike against Syrian positions near Beirut after the barracks bombings in 1983. Reagan, however, believed France's reasons were more cynical and material. The refusal upset me because I believed all civilized nations were in the same boat when it came to resisting terrorism. At least in the case of France, however, economic considerations prevailed. While it publicly condemned terrorism, France conducted a lot of business with Libya and was typically trying to play both sides. U.S. military assets began moving toward the Mediterranean, including the USS Enterprise, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier which would come through the Suez Canal, the first time such a ship was allowed through. In Paris, the Libyan embassy was plotting another attack on American citizens waiting outside the U.S. embassy, but French authorities narrowly prevented the attack. On April 14th, the German foreign minister went to Washington, D.C. to tell the U.S. that there was insufficient evidence to justify an attack on Libya. On the afternoon of April 14, 1986, congressional leadership was gathered in the Situation Room and told about the operation, including the time of the attack. After that meeting, a congressman leaked information to the press, telling them that they should turn their televisions on around 6 p.m. The operation was supposed to use the new F-117s, which at the time were still secret and wouldn't be made public until 1988. But at the last minute, Caspar Weinberger scrubbed the stealth mission, fearing it would expose their new aircraft's existence. Conventional aircraft would be used instead. The raid had 5 targets: the Bab al-Aziza barracks and the Murat Sidi Bilal training camps in Tripoli, the Mitiga International Airport, the Jamaria Guard barracks in Benghazi, and the Benina International Airport. On the night of April 14, 1986, the 24 F-111s took off from RAF air bases at Mildenhall and Fairford, being refueled mid-flight by KC-10 extenders and KC-135 Stratotankers. The USS America was already in the Gulf of Sidra, while the USS Coral Sea was speeding off from Naples through the Strait of Messina. Fighters on the USS America would provide cover for the F-111s bombing the targets. The attack began at 2 a.m. Libya time, lasted 12 minutes, with 60 tons of munitions dropped, and didn't begin firing anti-aircraft weapons until the F-111s had already reached their targets. One of the F-111s would miss its target, hitting civilian and diplomatic sites in Tripoli, narrowly avoiding the French embassy. Gaddafi and his family were in a Bab al-Aziza compound, escaping before the bombs fell thanks to a call from the Prime Minister of Malta, who had been warned by the Prime Minister of Italy, who had been alerted when several unidentified aircraft off the west coast of Sicily were detected. There were about 60 Libyan casualties. One of the alleged victims was the adopted daughter, Hannah. An infant girl's body was shown to American reporters, but their skepticism over whether the body shown actually belongs to Hannah, whether a Hannah even existed, or if this infant's death was the result of the raid. One of the F-111s did not survive the mission, shot down by one of Gaddafi's MiGs. At 9:15 p.m., Weinberger and Schultz gave a joint briefing to the press corps about the operation. Weinberger would respond to the reports about an adopted daughter of Gaddafi being killed in the attack.
The claim was, and is to this day, completely unverified, and was based only on highly suspect Libyan reports. Yet virtually every story about our raid accepted without question Gaddafi's statements that even had happened.
Admiral Kelso would say that the point of the raid was to demonstrate that the U.S. had the will to act against terrorism, and the noise and blast of the bombs sent the message clearly.
The surest way to measure the success of an enterprise is to ask whether it achieved its objectives. Our objective here was to end Gaddafi's belief that he could use terrorism without cost. That was accomplished.
The UN would condemn the attack as a violation of international law. The Non-Aligned Movement, the Arab League, the African Union, China, and the Soviet Union condemned the attacks as well. Mikhail Gorbachev would cancel a meeting between Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze and George Shultz in solidarity with Gaddafi. Former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark attempted to sue the U.S. and U.K. governments in U.S. federal court under international law on behalf of Libyan citizens, but the case was dismissed as frivolous. An additional appeal was denied, and monetary sanctions were placed against Clark and Saltani v. Reagan in 1989. However, the UK, Canada, Australia, Israel, and 25 other countries supported the operation. Gaddafi would go silent for several months after the attack, canceling public appearances, and by the end of 1986, the Libyan military would pull out of Chad, which denied Gaddafi access to its uranium supply for his clandestine nuclear program. Gaddafi, a man who had an ox with a painting of Reagan on the side, slaughtered in front of live audience, had this to say about Reagan. He is mad. He is foolish. He is an Israeli dog. Was Reagan trying to kill me? Of course. The attack was concentrated on my house and I was in my house. Libya would retaliate against the raid in a variety of ways. They fired Scud missiles at U.S. Coast Guard stations on the island of Lampedusa. He also ordered additional terrorist attacks, such as the Pan Am Flight 73 hijacking in Pakistan in September of that year. He also paid Abu Nidal terrorists who were holding American and British hostages in Lebanon to kill their captives. In 1987, Libya was discovered financing al-Rakin, the terrorist wing of the Black Pea Stones gang in Chicago. They would be convicted of conspiracy to commit terrorism and assassinations. On December 21st, 1988, the Pan Am World Airways Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 259 crew and passengers, as well as 11 people on the ground. Another bomb exploded on September 19, 1989, on Aren's Flight 772, flying from the People's Republic of the Congo to Paris. It exploded over the Sahara in Niger, killing 170 people. The US and Libya would have one last confrontation before Reagan left office. Late in 1988, the Reagan administration began ringing alarm bells that Gaddafi was building a chemical weapons plant in Rabta, and was being unintentionally aided by both West Germany and Japan. And in an interview, George Shultz said that military action was on the table. On the morning of January 4th, 1989, the USS John F. Kennedy was sailing toward Haifa. The carrier passed 120 miles north of Libya, with aircraft operating about 80 miles north, both of which were outside the Gulf of Sidra and 600 miles away from Rabta. 2 MiG-23s were sent to intercept, which were detected and shot down by F-14s. After the incident, Gaddafi accused the US of attacking unarmed reconnaissance planes on a routine mission. This was debunked 2 days later, when the Pentagon released photographs taken from footage taken by the F-14s, which clearly showed the MiG-23s were armed with AA-7 Apex missiles. But leaving the White House wasn't enough to get Reagan off of Gaddafi's hit list, as Gaddafi hired an assassin to kill Reagan in February of 1989, which obviously was thwarted. The Gaddafi saga would come to a close in 2003, when Libya gave up its WMD programs after the US invasion of Iraq, in exchange for security guarantees from the United States. This thawing of relations came to a head in August of 2008. When a settlement agreement between the US and Libyan governments over claims of harm by nationals of each country was reached, and signed in Tripoli on August 14th. Libya would pay $1.5 billion into a fund used to compensate the victims and their families of the Lockerbie bombings, the discotheque bombing, the UTA Flight 772 bombing, as well as the Libyan victims of the US bombings of Tripoli and Benghazi. Libya would pay for the settlement by raising the rates charged to foreign oil companies operating in Libya. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. Start your 2-week free trial by clicking the top link in the description or going to aura.com/casualhistorian. If you're interested in taking a trip to Turkey with me next April, check out the second link in the description to sign up for email alerts about the trip. If you have any questions about that, fill out the Google form listed in the description and I'll get your answers to you as soon as possible. I'd also like to thank my patrons for supporting the channel for another month, especially my newest patrons, Inquisitor Zarius, 9VR Watch, and Ryan Delaney. The patrons get early access to ad-free versions of the videos, along with my scripts, notes, and a private Discord server. If any of this sounds interesting to you, then go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.